military personnel on and around the battlefields. In the aftermath of the D-Day landings, for example, some men who should have been taken as a prisoner of war were shot and executed, and some German generals ordered their men to execute civilians and prisoners of war based upon Hitler's wishes. But there were a number of German generals who would either during the conflict or after face the ultimate punishment for their actions, and these men were executed either by Allied forces, Soviet authorities, or inside of nations where they committed their crimes. Welcome to the Untold Past. Today we look at the executions of the German generals of World War II, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Born on the 14th of April 1890, Johann Georg Rickert rose throughout the German military, throughout decades serving in the armed forces. He began his career inside of the army in 1909, but then had various different roles inside of the army, and he served in the First World War. It took over 3 decades for Johann Georg Rickert to rise to the rank of general, and he would obtain this during the Second World War. During the conflict, as Hitler was ordering his armies to rampage throughout different lands, he needed a number of senior generals and military commanders to oversee a large number of soldiers who did not necessarily have the most experience on the battlefield. Johann Rickert was placed in command of a number of different divisions, and he would be known for his brutal war crimes and atrocities. Rickert would throughout his command order that all of his own soldiers who were in hospital without a physical injury or diagnosed illness should be executed. He would rule over his men with brutality, and he was not willing to accept any form of shell shock, PTSD, or anything related to desertion from the front lines, and he saw this as a disgrace, and for this Rickert ordered many of his own men to be shot by his own firing squads, made up of their friends and comrades. Rickert also threatened units and commanding officers who would be defeated and would retreat during battle with execution, torture and punishment. He was ruthless with his own men, so you could imagine what Rickert would be like when dealing with prisoners of war and those who were captured by his forces. Rickert commanded the 286th Security Division that were based in the Soviet Union. This division was attached to the 4th Army and then took control of security duties in the areas following Wehrmacht advances, and they would carry out brutal actions against the population of local regions. They would carry out forced deportations and transportations, and they also rounded up civilians to be executed in the same manner as the Einsatzgruppe. Inside of Belarus, a quarter of the population was slaughtered during the German occupation, and the 286th Security Division, commanded by Rickert, were responsible for the large-scale war crimes and atrocities against the civilians, leading to thousands of deaths. Rickert was also the commander of the 35th Infantry Division, and he committed large-scale war crimes during 1944, and the division did this when Rickert was in control. The soldiers were ordered to take action against partisans and civilians, and they were involved in an operation in the Gomel region of Belarus. In this, 40,000 civilians were expelled from their homes, and they were ordered out when the German army were in retreat. Around 9,000 civilians died in this. Alongside the Sonderkommando 7B of Einsatzgruppe B, Rickert led forces to expel these civilians into the Ozarichi death camps. These were makeshift sites established to house thousands of people, and the crimes were described as one of the worst crimes the Wehrmacht ever committed against civilians. When the Soviets liberated the camp, they found thousands of dead bodies and freed 33,000 people, including over 15,000 children, who had been forced into the death camp by Rickert's men. But as the Second World War turned further against the Germans, Rickert was arrested by Soviet forces on the 8th of May 1945. At the end of the Second World War, there was a need inside of the Soviet Union for Stalin to impose his justice and will upon the enemies of his people. The Germans, and especially commanders inside of the Wehrmacht, were dealt with brutally by the Soviets, with many being sent to gulag camps and many succumbed to the brutality of them. However, there was a feeling inside of Soviet cities that executions would be one way that people would feel slightly reprieved because of the crimes of the German soldiers. In cities such as Leningrad, many different German war criminals were executed on gallows in front of large crowds, but Johann Georg Rickert was in 1946 brought to a trial by a Soviet military court in Minsk. He was charged with being a leader of a large-scale deportation, executions and the slaughter of Soviet civilians, as well as causing a huge amount of other crimes. Johann Rickert stood alongside a number of other war criminals, including General Gottfried von Erdmannsdorff, and the aim of the Minsk trial was to punish those who had been seized in Belarus and surrounding areas. There were 18 defendants, and these were men who had been accused of crimes against humanity in the region, which included mass execution, slaughter, and also the burning of houses and villages. General Rickert was for his actions sentenced to death, and he was seen as a terrible war criminal. But he would not need to wait long for his execution to take place. Inside of Minsk, set up was a huge gallows in a public square, and the very day after the German general had been sentenced to death, Rickert was brought out to the gallows for his execution. On the 30th of January 1946, in front of a large crowd of over 100,000 civilians who had flocked into the centre of Minsk to witness the execution of the German war criminals, Rickert was prepared for his final moments. There were people who had suffered during the Second World War, and many of the people of Minsk had seen their loved ones and family members, along with friends, being deported to concentration camps. They would never return after World War II. For this they saw the German army as the ultimate evil, and the commanders such as Rickert were also seen as a devil. This is why Stalin ordered many to be executed inside of Soviet towns and cities, inside of his lands, to win over the population, and to make it seem that his justice was being carried out. The huge gallows was set up in the middle of a horse racing venue in Minsk, and General Johann Georg Rickert was led to the gallows and was then led up the platform by guards, and on the scaffold the executioner was waiting for him. The executioner approached him and also the other condemned men, and he placed a noose around the neck of Rickert before the death sentence was then proclaimed, and a short speech was made to the huge crowd about General Rickert's crimes. Following this, the executioner then removed the platform underneath the German general, and in front of 100,000 people, General Rickert was left hanging, and he was executed. General Rickert was a brutal and barbaric military officer who during the Second World War had a number of different positions, commanding various groups of soldiers. But he was a ruthless man who would purge his own men to ensure they were strong-willed and minded, and he even had German men executed for trying to escape the craziness and chaos of the Eastern Front and the brutal battlefields. He was a man who carried out thousands of forced deportations, and he would then be responsible for huge war crimes, but Rickert was on the 30th of January 1946, at the age of 55, brought to his execution for his crimes, and because of this the horrific German general got his comeuppance. Anton Dostler was born on the 10th of May 1891, inside of Munich in Germany. He had a normal upbringing, but at an early age he did sign up to become a member of the German armed forces and the military. Dostler joined the army in 1910, and this would begin his decades-long service inside of the armed forces. He began his life in the military as a junior officer, and he would serve during the First World War. It's not known how much action Dostler saw during World War I, but he would emerge as a respected member of the armed forces. He returned to life following the war, and he would become one of the men who remained inside of the limited German army. Following the end of World War I, the German army was restricted to 100,000 soldiers, and Dostler was part of what was known as a Reichsheer, and he would continue to rise into senior positions within the army. At the beginning of the Second World War, and during the invasion of Poland, he would work as a chief of staff for the 7th Army. The 7th Army would work defending the French border region at the start of the war, and Anton Dostler was involved in making sure that Germany was not invaded at any part by the French or enemy forces. At the time, the Germans were on the offensive and were not the defensive ones, and the armed forces on their enemies were concentrated on fighting them on their own lands rather than invading. This meant that Dostler's job was relatively easy and straightforward. They fought in the thickest presses of the Soviet Union and were even deployed close to the Arctic Circle. But further transfers came for Anton Dostler, and he then commanded the 7th Army Corps and was moved from the Eastern Front to work inside of Italy, and he served as the commander of the Venetian coast. He was a man who was very well trusted, and was seen as a competent general inside of Italy, and he would be responsible for a war crime that would secure his execution. On the 22nd of March 1944, there were 15 American soldiers, including 2 officers, who landed onto the Italian coast. They would land 15 kilometres north of La Spezia, which was deep behind enemy lines. This was Operation Ginny 2, a mission in which the American commandos would try to conduct sabotage upon the German army during the Italian campaign. The plan was to blow up railway tunnels, which would break off communications and transport links for the Germans in central Italy. A previous attempt to do this failed, as the commandos could not find the tunnels, but a second try saw the American soldiers being dropped again in the wrong place. These men were dressed in proper American uniform. They did not have civilian clothing. They were dressed in the correct uniform, that if they should be captured, they should have been treated as prisoners of war. 3 of them did wear paratrooper boots, and some did have their jackets turned inside out, to hide any American Army insignia. They had no markings that said they were linked to the Office of Strategic Services, and they were armed with Colt 45 pistols, fighting knives, and 6 of the men had machine guns. The plan was to destroy a tunnel at Framura, between La Spezia and Genoa, but the men knew they were in the wrong place and wrong area. They then had to try and hide out, before they would hopefully be rescued, and they would hide in the day and then during the night try to establish contact with their PT boats, and then try to carry out the mission. The Americans left their rubber boats and explosives to blow the bridge where they could, and near to Carpeneggio they found an empty barn. But on the 23rd of March 2 men tried to find food, and then encountered a farmer who did help them. But around the same time, an Italian fisherman spoke with local fascist policemen, who then found the boats of the Americans, and they then located the explosives. These then spoke to the German command detachment, and then a search party was assembled to sweep the area. But all of the 15 soldiers who were hiding inside of the barn were captured following a short bit of fighting. They were then taken to the German headquarters of the 135th Fortress Brigade, based in La Spezia. 14 of these men did not give over any information. However, one would tell under torture the full information of the commando raid and how they were planning to blow up the tunnels. This was then sent to the offices of Anton Dostler and the headquarters of the 75th Army Corps, and Dostler then spoke to his superior, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, about what had happened. Dostler wanted to know what to do with the prisoners, and then Kesselring said the men should be executed in accordance with the commando order, the decree stated by Hitler that any Allied commando should be executed without trial. One of Dostler's assistants had refused to sign the order, as he knew these men were in proper uniform and that they should have not been executed. But Anton Dostler would be the one who signed off the execution order, and Colonel Almers, a man of the 135th Fortress Brigade, was ordered to carry out the execution, but he did not want to do this. He asked Dostler to delay, but Dostler refused to allow any concessions. There were further attempts to stop the Americans, but all 15 of them were executed in the morning of the 26th of March 1944 at Punta Bianca. The American soldiers were lined up by the Germans on a rocky outcrop, and they were then executed and were buried in a mass grave. It was this order that resulted in Anton Dostler himself being sentenced to death. Following the invasion of Italy, he was captured, and the American forces took him as a prisoner of war, but they discovered what had occurred with the commando team. Because of this, Dostler was found responsible, and he was placed on trial on the 8th of May 1945, and he was accused of war crimes. His military tribunal occurred at the seat of the Supreme Allied Commando, based in the Royal Palace in Caserta, and it would be the first Allied war crimes trial of World War II. Dostler was accused of having carried out an illegal order which violated the Geneva Convention, and it resulted in the murder and slaughter of Allied soldiers. Dostler claimed that his superior, Kesselring, had issued the executions, and that Dostler had just passed this on, but he claimed that the executions of the Americans was lawful, but he tried to wash his hands with the responsibility. However, this was not accepted, and despite appealing for clemency, Anton Dostler was found guilty of war crimes. It was said he was in violation of Article 2 of the 1939 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War, and that no soldier, and still less a commanding general, can be heard to say that he considered the summary shooting of prisoners of war as legitimate, even as a reprisal. But Dostler was a convicted war criminal, and the appeals were based upon the clothes that the Americans were wearing, as if they were found to have been in disguise as civilians or German soldiers. then their executions would have been deemed lawful, as they would have been classed as enemy spies. But due to the fact they were wearing American uniforms, it was classed as a war crime. But Anton Dostler was sentenced to death, and the execution would take place inside the Italian city of Aversa. He was to die by a firing squad, as a soldier would have wished for his execution. A 12-man group of American soldiers were gathered for this, and they were assembled before 8 a.m. on the 1st of December 1945. But Dostler was then brought out from his prison cell, and he was taken to a firing range. At the bottom of the range was a stake, and he was tied to the execution post, and his arms were bound, as were his legs. A black hood was then placed over his head, and the officer in charge then gave the order to fire. He was killed instantly, and following his execution, his body was gathered and was wrapped in a white cloth before it was buried in a German war cemetery. But Anton Dostler was a very prominent member of the German military, and he was a man who was well trusted by Hitler and other Wehrmacht generals. What signed his death warrant, though, was the fact he had signed off on the executions of American prisoners of war, who should have been given better treatment than they received. These men should not have been executed, but they should have been allowed to live out the rest of the war inside of a prisoner of war camp. Alfred Joseph Ferdinand Jodl was born on the 10th of May 1890 in Bavaria. As a child, it's assumed he had a rather normal family life, and he attended a school in which was linked to the military, and it was clear that Jodl would have a career from this in the army. He was from a rather affluent family, with his uncle being a psychologist at the prestigious University of Vienna, and his younger brother would also go on to become a general in the army. As the First World War broke out, he was pressed into service on the Western Front, serving in a battery unit. He was there at the very start of the conflict, and despite being wounded in action, he was rewarded with the Iron Cross Second Class. Jodl then returned to the front lines, but was transferred in 1917 across to the Eastern Front, and served here but then returned west. He won the Iron Cross First Class, and following the end of the First World War, he remained within the military. After the Treaty of Versailles was signed, Germany was allowed an army of no more than 100,000 soldiers, greatly minimising the strength and numbers of the army. Alfred Jodl was one of the lucky ones remaining as a soldier in the then labelled Reichswehr, and within this he was a greatly respected and well thought of soldier. Alfred Jodl first saw Adolf Hitler in 1923, when his power was virtually nothing. 3 years earlier, Adolf Hitler had become the Nazi Party's leading public speaker and propagandist, and as time went on, he then increased his stranglehold over the Nazi Party, becoming the leader. It was in 1923 when Hitler attempted to take control of Munich and subsequently be declared the President of Germany in the Munich Beer Hall Putsch. Jodl met Hitler before, and he became attracted to the Nazi ideologies and became a staunch supporter. As the 1920s continued and Hitler was released from prison, Jodl continued to help the group gain support, but he also continued his own rise through the ranks of the military. By 1935, he had risen to the rank of Major General. He met with Hitler before the Second World War broke out, and he must have impressed Hitler with his experience in the battlefield. Because of this, he was initially assigned as a commander of the 344th Division after the Anschluss of Austria, in which Austria was absorbed into the German Empire. After this, Jodl was then picked by Hitler to serve as the Chief of Operations Staff for the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW. The OKW was the High Command of the Armed Forces and oversaw the Army, Navy and Air Force. As the conflict continued, it had responsibility for the Second World War on all theatres except the fight against the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. Alfred Jodl found himself as a deputy to the chief of the OKW, Wilhelm Keitel, a man regarded by many as a yes-man for Hitler, and also found himself as the Chief of Operations Staff. He gained this job shortly before the invasion of Poland took place, and he was integral to the planning of the war and different invasions and operations, with Hitler seeing him as competent and effective. The OKW ran military operations on the Western Front, in Italy and in North Africa, but there was a degree of fragmentation between other groups, such as the Luftwaffe, who established their own command. The OKW would be led by Keitel, who reported to Hitler himself throughout the whole of World War II. Alfred Jodl acted as a leader and a chief of staff during the invasions of Norway and Denmark, making key strategic decisions in regards to these specific operations. Throughout the war, Jodl was confident about the German army and was convinced that the Germans would defeat Britain during the Battle for Britain, and believed an invasion would then take place. One of the biggest elements facing Jodl at the Nuremberg trials after the war was the fact he signed 2 military orders which were against the rules of war, were unjust and were criminal. Firstly, Jodl signed the Commissar Order on the 6th of June 1941, just before the outbreak of Operation Barbarossa. This order stated that any Soviet political commissar identified amongst captured enemy soldiers would be executed instantly. This order stated that all prisoners Bolshevized or influenced by Bolshevism should also be killed. Hitler, who gave the order, wished to rid Europe of communism and Bolshevism, the key enemies of Nazism. He knew when he issued this that it was illegal, but said that any soldier who carried out an execution or killing would be absolved by Hitler's Nazi Party and would not be held accountable. It stated that immediate and severe measures must be taken. They are therefore, when captured in battle, as a matter of routine, to be dispatched by firearms, indicating that they should be shot. The Commissar Order also stated that anyone with a red star with a golden hammer or sickle on the sleeves should be killed, showing the German army how to identify these specific people. Because of the Commissar Order, thousands of Soviet soldiers who should have been listed as prisoners of war and treated with certain allowances were shot dead when they should have been placed under custody. The other order Jodl signed was the Commando Order, signed on the 28th of October 1942. This stated that German armed forces should execute and kill all Allied commandos found in Europe and Africa without trial, if they are in uniform or not, and even if they attempt to surrender. This was allegedly issued by the OKW to combat the fact the Allies were allegedly violating the Geneva Convention and that commandos had been ordered to kill German prisoners. The secret order was carried out and said that any commander or officer who refused to carry it out would be punishable under German military law. It resulted in dozens of illegal executions and war crimes. Jodl, signing these orders, virtually signed his own death sentence after the war was over, with both the illegal documents resulting in lots of war crimes. As the conflict continued, he spent time at Wolf's Lair, Hitler's Rastenburg headquarters in East Prussia, and continued to be promoted. During the 20th of July plot to assassinate Hitler, when Klaus von Stauffenberg bombed the Wolf's Lair, Jodl was present in the room when the briefcase bomb went off and was injured, suffering a concussion. As the war turned against the Germans following the Normandy invasion and the Battle of Stalingrad, the enemies of the Nazis pushed the Germans back, and defeat was inevitable for Germany. Hitler, whilst Berlin was crumbling around him, shot himself, but instructions were then carried out, appointing Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor as the President of Germany. It's clear Dönitz must have respected Jodl, as when he formed his government in Flensburg, Jodl was there and was awarded the Knight's Cross by Dönitz. Jodl probably thought that he had a role in restoring Germany after World War II, and he signed the German surrender on the 7th of May 1945 as a representative of Dönitz, and then a week later when Wilhelm Keitel, his superior, was arrested, Jodl became the chief of the OKW, which was basically pointless with the curtains closing on World War II. Jodl was arrested with the rest of the Flensburg government by the British and was taken to a prisoner of war camp before he was brought to Nuremberg to face war crimes trials. Alfred Jodl was accused of conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning, initiating and waging wars of aggression, war crimes and crimes against humanity, all 4 of the charges. He was seen as a high-ranking member of the military, and the charges brought before him specifically related to the 2 illegal orders, the Commissar and the Commando orders, that Jodl signed, saying that those who would be regarded as prisoners of war should be just shot when captured. He was also accused of being complicit in other atrocities, and was presented with evidence about mass shootings of Soviet prisoners of war. He said that the only prisoners shot were those who did not want to walk. More evidence emerged with him being accused of being involved in the unlawful deportation of Jews and others, and also in ordering executions and being complicit in these. His signature was found on an order that sent Danish citizens and Jews to concentration camps, and this was also used against him. Jodl pleaded not guilty, however was found guilty of all 4 of the charges put forward against him. Because of this, he was sentenced to death and was to be executed in the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison by a botching executioner, John C. Woods. On the 16th of October 1946, these executions were carried out. The Nuremberg executions were noted for not going as straightforwardly as they could have done, as the executioner performed his role poorly. Firstly, the trapdoor was too small, and many who fell through smashed their heads on the side, causing bleeding. Also, John C. Woods did not use the same methods as other executioners, and many executions took a number of minutes for the condemned to be killed, slowly strangling to death. In some cases it took between 14 and 28 minutes for the condemned to die, and John C. Woods was noted for even pulling down on one body as the neck had not been broken, strangling a Nazi to death. Alfred Jodl was the 10th of 11 defendants to be executed, however was executed actually 9th, as Hermann Goering had taken his life the evening before. He was led into the gymnasium and was flanked by US soldiers. Inside the gym was a gallows that had been made to perform the deaths, and Jodl was brought in following Fritz Sauckel's death. He was brought into the room shortly before 10 to 3 a.m. in the morning, and he was led up the stairs of the gallows. He was then handed over to John C. Woods, who then asked him for any last words, and Jodl stated, "My greetings to you, my Germany." The hood was then placed over his head, and he was shuffled over the trapdoor before the door was released, and Jodl plunged straight through it. Judging by the fact that Arthur Sesenquart was executed 9 minutes after Jodl, we can consider that Jodl's execution was one of the more straightforward ones performed that day, with no bleeding being visible on his body or wounds from the trapdoor. Alfred Jodl was incredibly powerful during World War II and was known for being a prominent member of the Nazi High Command. He was a respected military general and leader, and along with Keitel wished to carry out Hitler's demands to invade different lands and build up a huge empire. It was Jodl himself who signed his own death warrant, being complicit in the signing of the commando and commissar orders, and this evidence could not be denied. When he was brought to Nuremberg, the evidence against him was incredibly damning, and later trials would prove that the commissar order was carried out with brutality. A further trial carried out the year later sentenced a number of Wehrmacht officers to prison time for shooting Red Army soldiers and POWs. Alfred Jodl was a key instrument in the Nazi war effort and in Hitler's plans to take different lands and inflict such misery and suffering onto people living there. Gottfried von Erdmannsdorff was born in April 1893, and he would serve in the German military for most of his life. He was part of the German forces during the First World War, and following the restrictions imposed upon the country after their loss in the Treaty of Versailles, Erdmannsdorff remained part of the army. He was amongst the 100,000 military soldiers that made up the Reichswehr, but as Hitler seized control, he would expand the German army and the military. But von Erdmannsdorff would then be involved as soon as the Second World War broke out, and he fought during the invasion of Poland and the battles of Belgium and then France. Quickly the German army seized control of these nations, forcing millions of people under German occupation. He would be a very decorated soldier and was awarded the Knight's Cross when he was a colonel in March 1942. The citation stated that he was awarded this because the independent decision of Oberst von Erdmannsdorff to break through in an easterly direction on the 21st of January 1942 and the successful prosecution of this operation through to the 25th of January 1942 would subsequently be of massive importance for the overall course of the combat. It was only with the help of Gruppen von Erdmannsdorff, consisting of 4 infantry battalion, 1 machine gun and 1 pioneer battalion, and a light artillery battalion, that a defensive front could be built up west of Bolkov. If this had been broken through, then it most likely would have required a costly attack to retake the salient position. But he was decorated for his work on the Eastern Front. When the Nazis launched Operation Barbarossa, it took many people by surprise. Even Stalin did not anticipate that the German army would rampage into the Soviet Union after they broke the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The fighting on this front was brutal and barbaric, and millions would lose their lives in battles such as Stalingrad and Kursk, and the fighting was very ferocious. As the German army would advance and move forward, they would be followed by mobile execution squads, who would slaughter and execute many civilians, including women and children. Gottfried von Erdmannsdorff was promoted to the rank of General Major, and on the Eastern Front, he would be involved in fighting the Red Army, and especially during the aftermath of the Battle of Stalingrad. On the 27th of June 1944, Soviet Red Army soldiers advanced forward and pushed towards Mogilev, and specifically to the north of the city, and they crossed the Dnieper River over a bridge. But the German Fourth Army had sent a message to General Erdmannsdorff that Mogilev was to be held as a fortified position, and it was ordered that the Germans would fight until the very last man. They were digging in heavily against the Soviets, and the Fourth Army would then retreat to the 39th Panzer Corps and the 12th Army Corps, who were around 20 kilometres west of Mogilev. This left the city to its fate, and it would be overwhelmingly attacked by the Soviets in devastating waves. General Erdmannsdorff had been pretty much abandoned to be captured by the Soviets or killed, and along with his soldiers he was on his own in Mogilev. He reported to the military hierarchy that evening that the Soviets were on the edge of the city, and that his men had been weakened, and that they were suffering from heavy losses. But then 3 hours later he said the only part of the city under his control was the city centre, and that brutal hand-to-hand fighting was now taking place between the remaining German soldiers and the Red Army, and the last message sent from his headquarters came at 11 p.m. that night. It was sent by another commanding officer, requesting that a captain was decorated with the oak leaves of the Knight Cross for his bravery. But with this, in the defence of Fortress Mogilev, General Gottfried von Erdmannsdorff was captured by the Soviet Red Army. His headquarters had been overwhelmed, and he was then seized rather than being executed on the spot, as he was of such a high rank. He was interrogated for information, but was then left to rot in a tough Soviet prison camp until 1946, when he was then brought to trial in Minsk. The Minsk trials occurred as a way of punishing those captured senior German officers and other criminals who had been seized in Belarus and in the surrounding areas. Alongside von Erdmannsdorff on trial was Johan George Rickert, another Wehrmacht general, and Eberhard Herf, a general in the Order Police of Minsk. There were 18 defendants, and these were men who were accused of crimes against humanity in the region, which included mass execution, deportation, and the burning down of villages and houses. General von Erdmannsdorff was condemned on charges of deporting 10,000 people in the Soviet Union, who were then sent to extermination or concentration camps, where they were then slaughtered. He was also accused of destroying villages, schools and churches, as well as executing and shooting disabled people during the creation of fortifications. When defending Mogilev, he was also accused of encouraging his soldiers to use civilians as human shields, resulting in innocent loss of life, and also in organising reprisal against civilians. These were people who were accused of helping partisans and the underground activities against the German army. He was also charged with establishing camps in which many people were sent to, where they were kept in terrible conditions, where they contracted diseases and then died. But he was then sentenced to death for all of these charges, and was briefly held that evening inside of a prison, before his execution would be then performed the next day, after he was condemned alongside the other men. On the 30th of January 1946, in front of a crowd of over 100,000 civilians, and people who had flocked to the centre of Minsk to witness the executions of the German war criminals, General von Erdmannsdorff was brought out to his execution. The people of Minsk had suffered heavily during the war, as many of them were deported, and they had lost family members and friends through execution and slaughter at the hands of the German army. So because of this they wanted to see some reprisal for the horror that they had been forced to live through. There was a large gallows set up in the middle of the horse racing venue in Minsk, and von Erdmannsdorff was led to the gallows when he was then placed on a platform. The executioner approached him and the other condemned men, and then placed the nooses around their necks, and then the death sentence was read out and proclaimed, and the crowd were forced to hear what General von Erdmannsdorff's crimes were, before the platform was then removed under the German general, and because of this, Gottfried von Erdmannsdorff was left hanging, and he was executed in front of the absolutely huge crowd. General von Erdmannsdorff was an experienced military leader and commander, and he had seen action in many different countries during the First and Second World War. He had led soldiers during the battles for Belgium and France and was very highly decorated, but his final stand would take place inside of a city in Belarus, where he was fighting against a fierce Soviet Red Army. The Red Army would overwhelm the Germans and would liberate the city, and in this a general was captured and he was then sentenced to death after being accused of a huge number of crimes during the Second World War. His actions led to the slaughter of civilians, and with this, he was executed. Ludwig Kubler was born on the 2nd of September 1889 inside of the village of Hopferau, which was close to Munich in Bavaria. His father worked as a doctor and physician, and he had a rather large family. Following his schooling, he graduated with top grades, and he did have a place at a prestigious school. However, Kubler dreamed of a career inside the military, and he chased this dream for himself. He joined the 15th Royal Bavarian Infantry as a cadet on the 20th of July 1908, and he then began to rise throughout the different ranks of the regiments, before he then attended the war school based in Munich. In terms of how skilled he was at this time, he passed his class 5th out of 150 students, and in January 1913 he then joined a machine gun company, and also took part in riding training to complete cavalry missions. He was a soldier who must have believed that learning was the forefront of every good soldier, as he did study a lot. But as the First World War broke out, Ludwig Kubler first saw action on the Western Front as part of the 15th Bavarian Infantry, and he was involved in tough fighting around Lorraine and also St. Quentin, and he was then given command of his own machine gun platoon. He received his first significant award on the Western Front, being given the Iron Cross Second Class. However, it wasn't long before he suffered a severe injury that would haunt him throughout the rest of his life. An artillery shell exploded near to him, and the splinters left him with a number of facial wounds, and these left a lot of scarring. But he was adamant to get back to the fight, as he returned to the front lines before his injury had healed properly. He then fought during the Battle of the Somme, and was then awarded the Iron Cross First Class. He finished the First World War as a Hauptmann or a captain, but as the Treaty of Versailles limited the German army to 100,000 soldiers, Kubler was one of those men who was retained in the new Reichswehr, which was established. He continued to serve inside the armed forces, and he became the General Staff of Group Command 1 in Berlin, and rose to the rank of Major, and then in November 1933, following the rise of Hitler to the position of Chancellor, he became the Chief of Staff of the 7th Division, before he moved across to the newly established Wehrmacht, Hitler's new army. He became a General Major the year before the Second World War broke out, but Hitler needed experienced soldiers for his aims and plans to spring a new war onto Europe. He relied on men such as Kubler to lead many men who had not been involved in conflict before. Specifically, Ludwig Kubler had been assigned to command the 1st Mountain Division, which was filled with soldiers from Bavaria and Austria. It was a very strong division, and at the start of the Second World War they saw action in Poland during the invasion. They were part of the 14th Army, and they had a number of victories, including the capture of the strategically important Dukla Pass, the lowest mountain pass in the Carpathian Mountains, and Kubler was then awarded the Knight's Cross for his command. After his fighting in Poland, Kubler's men were then sent to France, and they fought in the subsequent invasion, and they also saw action in the border regions. They were planned to be involved in the possible invasion of the UK, known as Operation Sea Lion, but the plans for this fell flat after a number of months of planning. They were also considered for the capture of Gibraltar, but this was also cancelled. Because of the scars on his face, Kubler was known as Limping Nurmi affectionately, and he then was asked to command the 39th Mountain Corps. They were involved in the invasion of Yugoslavia and then Operation Barbarossa. But on the 19th of December 1941, Kubler was appointed the commander of the 4th Army, and at this time he appealed to Hitler to withdraw some of his forces because of the terrible winter conditions of the Soviet Union, and many of his soldiers were dying because of the ill equipment they had been given, and also due to the extreme temperature. Hitler would not allow Kubler's men to withdraw, and he thought this was a disgrace, and he knew his men would suffer further if they did not seek help. Later, because of the problems in the Soviet Union, he was taken from his command position and was then placed in reserve, but in 1943 Kubler was then placed in command of Army Group Central Rear Area. This was a group of soldiers and men whose job it was to maintain the security behind the fighting forces, and to hunt down those who were being persecuted by the Nazis, and also those resistance elements such as the partisans, who were causing chaos with sabotage. Under Kubler's leadership were also groups of Einsatzgruppen death squads, who carried out mass slaughter inside of settlements and towns, gunning civilians down in huge pits and mass executions. They tried to attack people they regarded as bandits, and the actions of those men under Kubler's command resulted in the burning down of villages, deporting of thousands of people for slave labour, and the slaughter of thousands of people. Kubler continued to command units and groups until the end of the Second World War, but he was then wounded and captured whilst fighting in Yugoslavia. Kubler remained behind bars, and he was brought to a war crimes trial, and he was a defendant inside of a Yugoslav court alongside a number of other senior German officials, including General Hans von Höslin. Kubler was accused of war crimes, and his forces were linked to massacre and destruction of villages. He was then condemned to death alongside a number of other defendants, and was then to be executed. However, this is where there is confusion regarding his execution. There are many accounts that state that Ludwig Kubler was executed by hanging, on a gallows or possibly a hanging post or pole, but this was not the case in my opinion. The evidence discovered around this is in the death notice and certificate that was given following the execution of Ludwig Kubler and the other men. Many other defendants that are stated to have been given the death sentence are said to have been shot by a firing squad, and this was the case with Hans von Höslin. He was also condemned for war crimes by the same Yugoslavian court, and he was executed on exactly the same day as Kubler was, in the very same place. This leads to the probability that Kubler was executed alongside Höslin, who was also a general, and the death sentence notice also confirms that there were other members of the German military executed alongside them. Also, it was more common to execute senior members of the military using a firing squad or a gunshot, as this was considered slightly more noble than using hanging. On the 18th of August 1947, with this in mind, Ludwig Kubler was one of a number of men to be executed by the firing squad, which had been gathered. The executions took place in Ljubljana. The men had been taken from their prison cells, and they were executed early in the morning. Just after 5 a.m, Kubler was led out to the firing range, and he was secured to a post. He had been tied to this, and it's not known if a blindfold was offered to him, as his firing squad were gathered opposite him. The men to execute him were probably made up of a number of soldiers rather than just one sole executioner, and they were probably armed with their rifles. A commanding officer would have ordered the executioners to ready, and they would have stood facing Ludwig Kubler, the experienced German general, with poise, before they received the order to fire and shoot. This was then given, and the bullets then crashed into Kubler, and if he had not been killed instantly, the commanding officer, responsible for the firing squad, would have then given him a coup de grace gunshot to the head, finishing him off. The death notice mentions von Höslin, alongside others including Kubler himself, indicating that they all died in the same manner and in the same method on the firing range within Ljubljana. Ludwig Kubler was a senior member of the German military who fought in 2 world wars, and he commanded thousands of soldiers throughout his career. His forces during the Second World War were responsible for a number of war crimes, and specifically for this he was executed. There is some doubt as his execution method, but it is most probable that he was condemned by gunshot and a firing squad rather than using the gallows as has been previously listed. Eberhard Herf was born on the 20th of March 1887, and he rose throughout the ranks of the military from a young age. He in 1911 was a second lieutenant in the Grenadier Regiment King Wilhelm I, and he then served during the First World War. But Herf had applied before this to serve in command in a protection force in German East Africa, but he was then deployed in Europe. He became an adjutant in the 2nd Battalion of the Reserve Infantry and continued to be promoted throughout the conflict. He was in command at the start of 1918 of a heavy combat vehicle division, commanding tank movements, and he had been awarded both classes of the Iron Cross. But like many First World War veterans did, Eberhard Herf joined the Freikorps following the conflict, and these were right-wing former soldiers who were armed and who were protesting against the new German government, who had accepted the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Herf became a member of the security police in Frankfurt, and he transitioned to a role inside of the police too, where he then left to become an instructor. He switched from the military to the police forces, but in 1932 he joined the Nazi Party, and Hitler and his cronies would utilise the knowledge of Eberhard Herf, and in January 1933, following Hitler's seizure of power, Herf was made a battalion leader in the Berlin State Police, and then he became a commander in the Nazi police. He was moved around different places and was given different commands of different police departments within Nazi Germany, and he then applied to become a member of the SS in August 1938, and this was later accepted. Herf also took command of the North Group of the Berlin Police, and he then oversaw the Northern Police Regiment, who were during the Second World War involved in the Nazi policy of extermination in Eastern Europe. Because of this, he was moved to the city of Minsk and was made the commander of the Order Police there. Heinrich Himmler then personally accepted him into the SS, and Herf was given a new title, and Himmler would years later make him a Major General. However, his command of the Police Regiment North was brutal and ruthless, and he did get involved in many of the horrific crimes and slaughter of the Holocaust. He was involved in the deportations of thousands, and specifically in causing chaos inside of Minsk. The Minsk ghetto was set up and was one of the largest in the German-occupied lands of the Soviet Union. The ghetto housed around 100,000 Jews, and most of these were slaughtered, and it was Herf's men who got involved in policing and organising the ghetto. There was a lot of expansion within the ghetto to imprison more people, and each night around 70 to 80 murders were taking place at the hands of the Gestapo or the police forces every single night. There was also acts of mass slaughter carried out, as even the nursery and orphanage of Minsk was liquidated, and the children were executed, and some were even buried alive. It was said of this incident that, at that moment, several SS officers, among them Wilhelm Kubler, arrived, whereupon Kubler, immaculate in his uniform, threw handfuls of sweets to the shrieking children. All the children then perished in the sand. But Eberhard Herf's forces were involved in slaughtering alongside the Einsatzgruppe, and he was someone who later wrote to the Reich Security Main Office as he wanted to go elsewhere, and in this letter he claimed he wanted to get out of the East, since, to be honest, I've had enough. However, this was rejected and was not accepted, and at the end of the war, Herf was arrested and was imprisoned by the Soviet Red Army. He was then brought to trial inside of Minsk, the capital of Soviet Belarus, where he had committed a lot of his crimes, and those brought to trial were members of the German military, police and the SS officials, who had caused chaos inside of the lands. 18 men were placed on trial and were accused of crimes committed during the occupation of Belarus, and this included 11 members of the Wehrmacht, including 2 generals, 4 members of the Nazi police and a police general, and 3 members of the Waffen-SS and SD. Herf was accused of encouraging and ordering the mass murder of people in Army Group North Rear area, and also in his role as the commander of the Order Police in Minsk. He had been responsible for the slaughter of thousands, and some of the men who were brought alongside him to trial were George Robert Weissling, commander of the 26th SS Police Regiment, Ernst August Falk, battalion commander in the 26th SS Police Regiment, Reinhard George Moll, the local commander of Babrusk, a commander of a prisoner of war camp, Hans Hermann Koch, chief of the SIPO and an Einsatzgruppe officer, Rolf Oskar Bouchard, special commander in Brabjusk, August Joseph Bittner, Sonderführer and chief of the farm slave labourers, Bruno Goetzer, a commander, Paul Eick, a deputy commander, Bruno Mittmann, a soldier at Minsk, Franz Hess, a Sonderkommando member, Heinz Fischer, an SS corporal, Hans Hertel, a Wehrmacht private, along with Alois Hetterich and Albert Rodenbusch, 2 other Wehrmacht privates. But inside of the courtroom, all of the men who were accused of crimes against humanity were all convicted of the slaughter that occurred within Belarus and inside of the Soviet lands. There were 14 men who were sentenced to death, and these executions occurred in public in front of a huge crowd in a horse racing venue within Minsk. 3 generals were all condemned, including Eberhard Herf, and these were all executed in Minsk, in the city which had suffered a lot. The crowd had seen their family and friends suffer, and to many the executions of these condemned German war criminals were seen as justified. On the 30th of January 1946, Those men who had been condemned to death in the Minsk trials were brought out to their execution. A huge gallows site had been created in the horse racing venue, which was known as the Hippodrome. 100,000 civilians had gathered to see the executions of those men who had been sentenced to death, and within these was Eberhard Herf, and the men were brought out one by one to the gallows. On the gallows a noose had been placed around, and the men were then placed on the vehicle, and the noose was then tied around their necks before the vehicles pulled off, and each of the men were then left hanging. 14 of them were hanging from the gallows, and to the people of Minsk who had suffered these executions of these men and German officers was justified. Eberhard Herf was a ruthless and brutal commander of the Order Police who got involved in the slaughter of thousands of people during the Second World War. He complained and wanted to be moved from the Eastern Front for some reason, but he did not have the chance to try and escape to the West during the Second World War, and he was captured by the Soviets. They would show little mercy on captured members of the German military, especially generals, and the executions of those inside of Minsk were seen by Stalin as retribution for the horrors that occurred inside of the city. Helmuth von Pannwitz was born into a family of Prussian nobles in what today is considered Poland. As a young man he was part of the Prussian cadet school, and it was clear that he would undertake a career in the military. Before the First World War broke out, he was interested in the Cossack units, which were set up in towns nearby, but as a cadet officer, Pannwitz, when the First World War broke out, joined the Imperial German Army as a volunteer, and he was at the age of 16 promoted to the rank of second lieutenant. He was seen as a talented future leader in the German army, and he would at a very young age be decorated with the Iron Cross Second Class for bravery. But following the war he was part of the Freikorps, and they fought against the Polish separatists, and he was involved in the Kapp Putsch. Helmuth von Pannwitz was then accused of being a suspect in the murder of a political opponent, but he then fled to Poland, where he was involved in other politically motivated murders. He became a leader in other groups, but then in 1931 he was granted amnesty for his crimes, and he then returned to Germany following this. He then became a Stabsführer of the SA in Silesia, and he took control of a cavalry squadron of brown shirts. Von Pannwitz was also working alongside the Gestapo during the Night of the Long Knives, and he was then invited to join the Nazi Party, and he rejoined the German army in 1935. In 1938, after the Anschluss, he was sent to Austria to become a detachment commander of the cavalry regiment. However, as the Second World War broke out, he commanded a recon detachment who saw action in the invasions of Poland and France. But he continued to be decorated and received the Knight's Cross and Oak Leaves a year later for his military leadership, when he was drafted to the Eastern Front, where he led soldiers covering the southern flank during the Battle of Stalingrad. But he then created a Cossack group of soldiers, the Cossack Cavalry Brigade, in April 1943, who took part in anti-partisan activities in Belarus and Ukraine. These soldiers fought partisans, and they were seen as a useful tool for the Germans, who were constantly annoyed and hit by the partisans. Pannwitz's brigade carried out operations in Serbia and Croatia, and they would conduct horrific slaughter of the civilians. They would carry out large-scale assault and execution. They would round up innocent people and would shoot them quickly, but Pannwitz would then issue orders regarding these, as he was concerned that this sort of behaviour would lead to mutiny. He would even stand up for himself against Hitler, and would state that the Nazi policies which led to the mass execution of the Slavs were wrong and inhumane. But there were upgrades to his Cossack divisions, and Pannwitz was then made a general. He would allow his soldiers to attend Russian Orthodox services, and he was a popular leader, but by the end of the Second World War the SS seized control of all foreign units of the German army. Himmler came to an agreement with von Pannwitz, and he said that his division was to become part of the SS in terms of supply and replacements, but the Cossacks were allowed to keep their uniforms and their ranks. Pannwitz refused to become an SS member to begin with, and he said, "I've been in the army since I was 15. To leave it now would seem like desertion." But Himmler wanted Helmuth von Pannwitz to take control of all Cossack forces, but the general then consented, and he joined the SS, switching from the German military. Pannwitz surrendered on the 11th of May 1945 to the British and Austria, and he wanted to make sure that his soldiers were imprisoned by the Western Allies, but they were then transferred to the Soviet Union, and they would be treated much worse. Pannwitz was a German national, and was not to be repatriated to the Soviet Union under the Yalta Agreement, but he was then placed on a transport of Cossacks and he would be arrested by the Soviets. One British report regarding his transfer to the Soviet Union said that von Pannwitz clearly wanted to dissociate his German officers and ultimately himself from the Cossacks who were traitors to their country. Even when General von Pannwitz stepped out of the vehicle which had conveyed him across the Russian border, he was obviously surprised to see the Russians throwing up his arms, exclaiming "Mein Gott!" But he was then imprisoned for some time, but the circumstances regarding his execution remain rather sketchy. It's known that inside of Moscow, and specifically inside of the Vortovo prison, von Pannwitz was executed. It became a place which was notorious as a site of NKVD execution during the Great Purge, and it's believed that he was hanged inside of the prison. He may have also possibly been shot. He had been found guilty of war crimes against the Soviet people during the Second World War. There were attempts to rehabilitate Pannwitz's reputation after the war, but this was turned down eventually after it was considered that he was a Nazi war criminal.
Karl Heinrich Rudolf Wilhelm von Stulpnagel was born on the 2nd of January 1886, and he was born into a noble family. He had a normal upbringing and schooling, and he then served inside of the Prussian army after he left school. As the First World War broke out, Stulpnagel was involved in the conflict, and throughout it he served as a general staff officer, and he rose throughout the different ranks. But after the war he was a member of the Freikorps, the right-wing paramilitary rebels who would protest the Weimar government and their decisions following the First World War, and he was involved in putting down the German Revolution in 1919. He would also interestingly remain inside of the German armed forces, which were known as the Reichswehr, and these were limited in their numbers to 100,000 soldiers. Stulpnagel rose to the rank of colonel in the new army, and had reached this by the advent of Adolf Hitler's rise to power. But to begin with, Stulpnagel was said to have been a strong and fierce opponent of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. It was said that he was described by his colleagues as a chivalrous gentleman schooled in philosophy. Von Stulpnagel was opposed from its inception to the Nazi regime, with many fellow officers he regarded as a stain on his honour of the country. But in these years following he was appointed as the head of the Foreign Armies branch of the General Staff of the Army, and in 1939 he published an article which was anti-Semitic and anti-Bolshevik. By 1936 he had been made a Major General, and he was then placed in command of the 30th Infantry Division based in Lubeck. However, he was then made a Lieutenant General before he was made the Deputy Chief of the General Staff of the Army. But he would in secret begin to get involved in military opposition to Hitler and the Nazis, and he would begin to try to remove Hitler from power, but these plans were abandoned following the Munich Agreement. He was linked to other high-ranking military members at the time, including Admiral Wilhelm Canaris and Colonel General Ludwig Beck, and they believed that the SS were also trying to take control of the German army, and there were possible plans drawn up to use the army's regiment against the government in Berlin in a coup. But as the Second World War broke out, Stulpnagel was a general of the infantry, and he was in command of the 17th Army. Following the launch of Operation Barbarossa, the military commander of German-occupied France, and he would during this time still remain in contact with people who had ideas about stealing Jewish property without properly compensating them. With this he then in the Soviet Union he signed many orders that resulted in the deaths of civilians in reprisal for partisan and resistance attacks against the German army. With this he worked closely alongside the Einsatzgruppen, who carried out the slaughter and mass execution of Jews on the Eastern Front. He did have words with his soldiers with regards to their chaotic actions on the Eastern Front and for taking hostages, but he did order his soldiers to focus on Jews and communists who needed rounding up, and these then would be executed and slaughtered by the Einsatzgruppe. But as mentioned, he joined the conspiracy which would result in the most serious attempt upon the life of Adolf Hitler. The Stauffenberg plot, as it was known, would be made up of many senior military officials and generals. They planned a military coup, and this was believed to have been very well organised, but on the 20th of July 1944, inside of Hitler's Wolfslair headquarters, a bomb which had been planted and placed by Stauffenberg inside of a briefcase exploded. Hitler was injured in this, and his clothing was torn to shreds, and if it was not for a wooden table leg, then Hitler would probably have been killed. But Karl Heinrich von Stulpnagel's involvement in the plot was key, and it was his job to round up as many SS and Gestapo officers in Paris as he could, and then imprison them. He arrested 1,200 men and cut off all communication between France and Germany. However, he had problems convincing Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge to support the uprising after the failing of the plot, and with this he was forced to release the prisoners under his watch. But at the end of the plot, Hitler was gripped by the titanic fury and unquenchable thirst he had for revenge, and he ordered Heinrich Himmler and Ernst Kaltenbrunner to arrest every person who dared to plot against him. Hitler said that, this time the criminals will be given short shrift. No military tribunals will hale them to before the People's Court. No long speeches from them. The court will act with lightning speed, and 2 hours after the sentence it will be carried out, by hanging without mercy. It's believed that in the aftermath of the failed bomb plot, that 4,980 people were arrested by the Gestapo, and Heinrich Himmler gave instruction that these men should be tortured. He also targeted the family members of the arrested, and the kith and kin law was used with many family members being tortured and executed. The Gestapo were given legal allowances to threaten to kill, torture, and execute wives, children, parents, brothers and sisters of those involved in the plot. But as mentioned, General Stulpnagel was forced to release the 1,200 SS and Gestapo men in Paris. But Hitler must have known that he was involved, and Stulpnagel was recalled to Berlin to answer for himself, and when he travelled from Paris, he stopped off at Verdun, and he tried to kill himself by shooting himself in the head with his pistol on the banks of the Meuse River. He knew he would face execution for his actions, but this action failed, and he actually succeeded in blinding himself. In the aftermath of this, he was heard deliriously mumbling and muttering the words, Rommel, and he was clearly not well, and with this he was the first person to implicate the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, in the Stauffenberg plot, and his actions would lead to Rommel's death. He was operated on that evening, and despite his life being saved, he was left blind. But Hitler would spare nothing for General Stulpnagel, and he would, when he got to Berlin, be taken to the Gestapo cells in Prinz Albrechtstrasse. He was tortured brutally and badly, and was beaten severely. He would confess that Rommel had told him that, tell the people in Berlin they can count on me, alluding to the fact he would become the leader. He was brutalised and clearly was a man who was now of no threat, and was now disabled, but Hitler would still force him in front of the People's Court, the heavily Nazified court that would result in the executions of most people who were put up in front of it. Judge Roland Freisler proceeded over his trial, and would chastise and scream at Stulpnagel, who was brought into the courtroom on a stretcher. He was found guilty of high treason on the 30th of August 1944, and on the same day he was executed. Inside of Plötzensee prison's execution chamber, there were a number of execution methods available to executioners. There was a guillotine, but also a hanging beam, in which piano wire was used to hang those who were complicit in the July 20th plot. Stulpnagel was one of those who were hanged in this way, and it was horrifically brutal, and his guards prolonged his suffering, as they kept lifting his body up and dropping it as Hitler had ordered for those who were involved in the treasonous plot against him. But he would also ask for the executions to be filmed, so he could watch them back as entertainment in the evenings before he went to bed. This is what happened to Stulpnagel, and it was a brutal and barbaric end for a man who had a long history in the German military, and he also had a long history of dissenting against Hitler and the Nazis. Hitler would ruthlessly deal with those men who were complicit in the attempt on his life, and the July 20th plot was considered the most serious one that would threaten the life of the Nazi dictator. Stulpnagel was blind when he was executed inside of Plötzensee prison's execution chamber, and he was a man closely linked to the scheme. But Hitler would show no mercy upon him, and with this at the age of 58 he was condemned and dispatched by the executioners shortly after his trial. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.